And we're live. Welcome to the Tara Palmieri Show meets the Red Letter on YouTube and Substack to talk about the hottest race in America right now, the Senate race in Texas. It always captivates the imagination of the wonks for people who are truly engaged in politics, because Democrats have come so close for so long to winning statewide in Texas, but it hasn't been since 1994, if I'm correct. Yes, they haven't won since 1994 in Texas. But even Beto O'Rourke, he captured the nation. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on these races, whether it's Colin Allred, who I think raised over $100 million, Beto O'Rourke on one single race. And they get so close. And it's become a bit of a white whale. And that's why I've got Alex Hoffman on the show. He's a Democratic strategist, and he's always keeping it real about what is possible for the party and whether this is the perfect storm. Is it finally the perfect storm for Democrats? We'll see. We're going to break it all down. We're going to talk first about how did James Talarico, a guy who really ran on unity rather than resistance, on a more moderate message than an anti-Trump message in Texas, how he was able to take back some of Trump's gains actually in Texas and to defeat Jasmine Crockett, who arguably had much bigger name identity and a larger following and obviously a closer connection with the Democratic base, how he was actually able to win a primary. We're going to go into all of it and more. What does it mean? Next steps, Republicans. Stick around, leave your questions in the comment section, and we are going to put your questions up for Alex to answer because he's the inside guy. He advises both candidates and donors on strategy and how to help Democrats win. Alex, thanks for joining the show. I want to talk about this. How did James Talarico beat Jasmine Crockett despite her profile and the Kamala Harris endorsement?
Thanks for having me. And I think just to answer those two quick things, one, by being the better candidate, and two, I don't think anyone's ever going to convince me that Kamala Harris endorsement in Texas is going to be a good thing. I mean, last I remember, I think she lost Texas by 15 points. I'm not sure that helps. I mean, sure, Democratic primary, but I think that proved that didn't really matter. Last time you and I talked, I said something negative about Kamala Harris, and the first thing Fox News did was clip that and say that. So before I do say things about that, Fox News, if you're listening, happy to say that live. But I mean, listen, I think I know she just endorsed Talerico after he won. I think the best thing that Kamala Harris can do to help Democrats win is not endorse or say anything personally. But look, when it comes to Texas specifically, look, I think Talerico ran a great race. I think, first of all, he got out really early. Jasmine obviously jumped in a little later. Colin had to get out of the race for her to jump in. I think James really has done an interesting job weaving in faith and freedom and the flag and the three things that usually Democrats are told that we don't represent. And I think especially in Texas, those things actually really, really matter. And, it's nice to see that there are candidates out there that, don't have to just cede the ground to Republicans on that. But, frankly, I think the big difference maker is that, James was talking about Texas, right? I think, Jasmine's profile, and don't get me wrong, she's great, but Jasmine's profile is all about anti-Trump and, just all things that are negative to the MAGA administration and MAGA movement. And I think James kept it very Texas, which, to me is how you win.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I just got cut out for a second from the show, and I've just had some technical issues, but I do think you're right. And I wonder if this is the sign that Kamala Harris should probably stop making endorsements for the party, or maybe she needs to choose where the right place for her endorsement should be. And maybe it's also a sign that she should probably sit out 2028.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of opinions and feelings on that. I mean, look, first, on the Texas side of it, I think at the very beginning of this, you mentioned, white whale versus perfect storm. And like, I've been definitely on record saying that Texas has been the Democratic white whale for a really, really long time. And I think a lot of people looked at this race as, is this a perfect storm, right? Are we going to have the, the right candidate up against, frankly, the Republican wrong candidate, right? And, I think, Kamala endorsed Jasmine. They obviously have a good relationship. I mean, that was her choice. Clearly that endorsement didn't mean anything. Look, I think, especially for Texas, as much as I think the donors try to make this more of a nationalized race, this race has to be about Texas. It has to be about who's going to provide and do the best service for Texas. And, I think James proved that and said that to a lot of people in the primary. And I think, in the general, he's going to prove that he absolutely is the right choice to represent Texas. Right. And, look, I think this is really going to come down to, are we, for that quote unquote perfect storm, are we actually running against the right candidate? Right. I mean, if it's Paxton versus Talerico, I really like our chances, right? If it's Cornyn versus Talerico, I think we're still wading into that Beto O'Rourke anti-Ted Cruz feel. But certainly there's no doubt in my mind that Talerico gives us the best chance. He's always been the one that's going to give us the best chance. And, as long as we have a chance against someone like Paxton, for sure. Cornyn, I think, sure, still have a shot, but a lot harder road, right? I mean, people forget John Cornyn's been around for a long time, right? He knows that state. I mean, he's won in that state a lot. Now, obviously, we've talked about this before, but a lot's going to come down to who Trump endorses. I mean, certainly I think a Trump endorsement in this race matters a lot more than a Kamala Harris endorsement in this race.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Trump, by not endorsing, essentially created this issue that the Republicans are in right now. I find it to be very interesting that a lot of people who used to work for Donald Trump, that work on John Cornyn's team, they were not able to secure an endorsement for him, but we will get into that. We'll get into that later. So I want to talk about Talerico's campaign. He really, he ran on faith, unity, coalition building, and really the idea of running on faith. He's a pastor. He's in his 30s, early 30s. It's really different than this kind of punchback resistance we're seeing, the body slam politics, the anti-Trump resistance. It's offering, do you think it offers a new model for how Democrats should run in 2028? Or should they go with the Gavin Newsom style of trolling, go when they go low, you go lower?
Well, I mean, listen, as a person who's never bought into the when they go low, we go high mentality, I would love to just see Democrats fight back more all around the country. I think you're already seeing a lot of that. Certainly, I think a lot of our governors are showing how to fight back, Gavin being one of them, but there's many others that have really been standing up to Trump over the last year at this point. Look, I think James is a very different candidate, right? I mean, for Democrats to win in Texas, we needed something different, right? We needed someone who couldn't be painted as this, Democratic, quote unquote, woke, liberal, out of touch, anti-American, lack of faith candidate, right? We've been painted and tagged as that way too much, right? And, the fact that James can get up there and quote the Bible more than, pretty much any other Republican currently serving. I mean, that's a strong thing for us to have, right? I mean, I would love nothing more than for people to understand that just because Republicans say, or MAGA folks say, that they represent the flag and faith and all those things, doesn't mean that we have to cede the ground for that, right? We're just as patriotic. We're just as, devoted to our own faiths. I think if we had more candidates that sounded looked like James in a way that, can get out of the stump and really connect with people at a personal level, I think that is a huge model that we should run on. I mean, now granted, there aren't necessarily James Talaricos in every single state, but, I think it's incumbent upon Democrats to find them, right? I mean, if we could have found James Talarico, 10 years ago and, did what Republicans do and kind of play the long game on some of these candidates where we really kind of position them to long-term be successful, who knows? I mean, I'd love to find candidates like James, not necessarily on just the faith or that side of things, but just generally that, around the country, we should be cultivating and putting into positions where we can make sure that they win in the long run. And, if that means that we lean more into certain messages that Republicans think is their own and that they have a monopoly on, so be it, right? That's the thing I like that I want to see about Democrats do, right? Take the fight to them. Don't let them define the ground that we're fighting on. Instead, we need to be able to say, no, we own those values just as much as you can. You can't claim the flag belongs to you, or that patriotism belongs to you, or that faith belongs to you. It has to be people deciding for their own which candidate really truly represents that. And like, that's a great example going against Paxton. No one's going to tell me that in a James Talarico, James Paxton scenario, that someone's going to look at Paxton and say, yep, that person definitely represents my values of faith and all these things. Like, I just don't see it. Right. And I think there's an authenticity to that that's been missing among a lot of Democrats. And, I think James has that authenticity, right? So, in that mindset, could that be a perfect storm? It's possible, right? But, again, it's still Texas.
Yeah, no, you make a lot of really good points. Hold on one second. Sorry, I'm trying to, we're having a lot of technical difficulties today. I'm going to... Okay, we're back. Lots of technical difficulties today, but I'm back. Everybody, don't you worry, okay? Okay, so I want to keep going though. So, I think we also need to consider the fact that James Talarico campaigned earlier. Like, he didn't, he campaigned before Crockett, and while she came on the scene late and with a huge national identity and a huge national, name, he was laying the groundwork in places that she was not. But I wonder how much this exposure at the end from Colbert, when Stephen Colbert said that the FCC was telling him that they weren't allowing him to air the Talerico interview. Suddenly, this guy, James Talarico, this 30-something who was in Jasmine Crockett's shadow overnight, raised $1.25 million. I mean, maybe that was a game changer. And then millions and millions of people had to watch this interview that couldn't be aired on CBS News, right? It was amazing. Like, what would you say that's worth in advertising, political advertising?
It's tough to put an actual number on how much that probably was worth. I mean, the Colbert thing, no question, helped tremendously, right? I mean, I think, when I always think of Texas, I always think of Republicans want us to spend money there, because if we're spending money in Texas, it means we're not spending money in other places that we could be winning. And, look, maybe they did a calculation somewhere. Someone said to the folks at Paramount Skydance, hey, James Talarico's a big threat to us. We can't have him on. So maybe that backfired for them. I mean, they also could have seen it the opposite way, where maybe they thought, this was going to just create more division among Democrats. I think no one's going to really know what the backroom decision-making was on how that came out. But in the end, there's no doubt that tremendously helped James, right? I mean, I think that helped certainly on the donor side, right? Like, I think, let's be clear, you mentioned it. James was out very, very early. James was definitely around at various different counties and places that other people weren't, starting earlier. He also happens to be, a state representative, so he's always on the ground there. I mean, Jasmine obviously is in Congress, so, she's has to be in Congress a lot, right? But, I think there's no question that James really, because he got out early, because he had a lot of this kind of infrastructure that's built around, by the time the Colbert stuff happened, I think it was like injecting jet fuel, right? Versus Jasmine. I mean, look, I think if you ask any other operatives kind of in the space at this point, I think there was a lot of stuff written about she was running a quote unquote unconventional campaign or non-traditional campaign. I think that was kind of code for not running a very good campaign. Look, I think she obviously tapped into pockets of voters that I think obviously are very, very important to James winning in the long run. I'm glad to see that she conceded. I'm glad that she endorsed him. I'm glad that she's saying that she'll do all she can, because we got to make sure the Democrat wins.
There was a concern about that, for
right,
sure.
Yeah, and listen, I hope she does that, right? I hope that she's the one knocking on doors in Dallas and in Houston, been making sure that all those folks are coming out to vote for James that may have voted for her. And listen, I mean, the thing that got pointed out last night, this voter suppression issue, I mean, that's a real thing, right? That's been baked into the cake to fight against Democrats for a really long time, and we saw great examples of it yesterday. And I mean, it's just some of the things that James is going to consistently be up against, right? And I think the more we can have real levels of Democratic unity here, where we're actually coming together and saying, hey, you may have voted for Jasmine before, but James, and you don't hate James, so you should get on board with James because he's definitely better than Ken Paxton and certainly, better than John Cornyn by all metrics right now. So, the hope is that the fact that James has already been out there in a lot of these counties that we don't normally go into, and, now having won and frankly, now having Jasmine's support, I think, that should hopefully carry him. Right. But like I said, now it's about the other side. Right now it's about, is it Paxton or Cornyn? Where does Trump fall in on that? Is that going to be the thing that leads us to this perfect storm, right? Is it going to be that we're up against a guy like Ken Paxton, who has a terrible record? The guy was almost impeached, like all these things, right? And
he was getting divorced on biblical grounds.
Right. Yeah,
security
exactly right.
Fraud. You could just list off the name. The guy is problematic.
Yeah, I mean, he's a dream to run against if you're any candidate, let alone someone like James, who, I mean, again, as you see James, you can't really question his faith. You can't really question who he is. He's as authentic as it gets. But on the other side of it, you look at Ken Paxton and you go, hey, this guy's going to do whatever it takes to win or just suck up to Trump in any way, shape, or form. And clearly we can't trust him. His people in his own party don't trust him, right? Like, I think if that's the guy that James is running against, I think we got a great shot.
Yeah. And you didn't think that there was a great shot with Beto, and you thought that was a white whale. Then you thought the same thing.
And listen, look, I mean, there are a couple things that always, to me, are why this is a white whale. First of all, the voter suppression issue is real, right? We saw that last night, and we're going to see it again, right? Like there is no question that anytime we're going to see an instance where we're saying, hey, stay in line, someone on the Texas Supreme Court isn't going to say, nope, sorry, you can't vote, right? Like we're going to see that more, not just for this next election, but in many elections to come, right? Voter suppression is one, right? The second is, we're always, especially as a party, especially in Texas, obsessed with demographics, right? We're obsessed with this idea that, if we just get enough Latino voters or Black voters or X, Y, and Z specific demographic to vote for us, that's going to be it, right? And I think certainly over the last couple of elections, we've shown that we aren't necessarily winning Latino voters, and we don't necessarily have the right messaging. We're too busy, in 2024, we were too busy talking about, abortion and immigration instead of talking about, education and healthcare, right? And the economy, right? And, in my mind, I think where James can set this apart a little differently is he's already been on the ground. So he actually understands, I think, what real folks in Texas are actually looking for. But I think he can talk about issues that are directly affecting folks in Texas: affordability, right? Healthcare, education, energy, right? I mean, all of those things are super important in a lot of these pockets where those demographics exist. I don't think you could have said the same thing about Beto. I don't think he was able to market himself in that same kind of way. But again, like I think this has to be that perfect storm, right? It's a white whale until it's a perfect storm, right? And no matter what, we're going to be fighting the suppression issues. We're going to be up against, can we convince demographic groups to vote for us? We're going to be up against, frankly, an entrenched machine that's been in Texas, that's been winning in Texas for decades, right? I mean, like you said, we haven't won statewide there since the 90s, right? I mean, that's a problem, right? So like, I mean, do we have the infrastructure to compete with that? Will we have the money? But yeah, we'll probably have the money because a bunch of people will flood a bunch of money in. But, is that enough to get over the suppression issues? Is that enough to get over the demographic issues? But we'll see. I mean, and by the way, I'll say one last thing about this. I think Democrats have moved from this model, and, Greg Schultz says this all the time, that we used to be this party that was all about, persuasion, and then we moved to turnout. It was all about it went from how do we persuade people and how do we convince people that we have the right message and that we can actually win and that we're actually going to provide for you and support you as the voter, to, okay, this is a math problem. We just got to get X number of people out there. We just got to get them out. And if more of our people show up, we're going to win. And I think where you have a candidate like James, who maybe speaks to more of the independent voters, or maybe speaks to frankly, even some conservative Republican voters who frankly don't like a guy like Paxton. And they can say, look, I may not agree with James 100% on every single thing, but certainly maybe he identifies a little bit more with my values, or, Texas values, as they'd say, than a guy like Paxton would.
Yeah. But if you are a Republican looking at Talerico, what weaknesses are you trying to exploit? Because I'm hearing from the White House that he's a radical, Mom Donnie, this and that. Like, they are trying to make him seem like he is radical as AOC, as they would like to, as they see as the most radical, Democrat in their minds. But that's not who Talarico is. And do you think that the people of Texas are buying that messaging?
I mean, I think that is, first of all, obviously, I'm not a huge Mamdani fan. I've been pretty on record about not being a big Mamdani fan. I think he's going to cost Democrats a lot of elections because I think of some of his radical left-leaning policies are not what speaks to most of America personally. But I think, what the typical Republican and MAGA playbook is, anything other than us is radical, woke, left. And, I think it's about, are people willing to open their own eyes and make their own decisions and, hear these folks out, right? I mean, I think the Trump MAGA world and landscape has moved people a little bit away from, just because you have a D next to your name or an R next to your name doesn't necessarily mean that you represent one thing or another, right? Like, you can be your own independent person, make up your own individual mind and say, you know what, this person actually represents my values. This person does speak to me. This person does actually understand what it means to, have to work multiple jobs or worry about affordability or worry about healthcare, worry about my kids' education, right? I think we're starting to see in certain places around the country, and Texas could be one of those places, that, maybe a guy like James is appealing because, he understands and can speak to my own values, right? I mean, again, I think they're going to try to paint not just him, but any Democrat as this woke, left, liberal, whatever, Mamdani-esque figure. But I think I give a lot more credit, hopefully, to the average American voter who hopefully can make up their decisions for themselves and not fall for the trap, right? I mean, if you're seeing on social media, if you're meeting this guy, I think those are two totally different versions of what you're hearing, right? There's the version that MAGA Trump land want to, try to say he is, versus when you actually hear from him or meet him, you go, that doesn't sound like what you're describing. Like, I've never heard this guy, a super woke left Democratic, whatever, quote a verse from the Bible and talk about how that's why we should be, understanding things about our neighbor and, treating everybody with respect and, making lives better for people instead of harder for people. Right. I mean, I think he had that great line about, like we're talking about the wrong 1%, right? Like, talking, the folks on the Republican side are going to always want to talk about the transgender issue or talk about, Muslim ban X or whatever it is. And he's like, we're talking about the wrong 1% here. I mean, like, that's a great line that I think has stuck with a lot of people that James used. And I think as much as Republicans are going to try to paint that, I think it's going to be hard with a guy like him.
You always see Democrats doing better when they pick preachers in red states. Who's the I'm blanking on his name.
Raphael Warnock in Georgia is a great example.
Georgia. It's sometimes like I do think when they pick preachers, they tend to do better because they resonate with the community in ways, and I don't know. It just seems like there seems to be a trend there.
I mean, honestly, I think Democrats have figured out over the last couple of cycles that, like I said, we shouldn't be ceding the ground on faith, on the flag, right? Like, we should be able to say that we have Democratic candidates. I mean, honestly, a great example of that have been a lot of veteran candidates, right? There's plenty of veteran organizations that have popped up over the last few years and beyond that are running more Democratic veteran candidates, right? And it used to be like, Republicans said, we're the strong military party, and we can run the good veterans, and that's become the exact opposite, where a lot of veterans that we've had have been winning all over because they've looked around and said, I don't want to send a bunch of people to war, and you guys lie to the American public when you're like, oh, no more wars, and then stuff with Iran happens, right? Like, it's like you're just starting to see some of those trends change a little bit, where I think all of a sudden you're starting to see Democrats, or at least people identify as a Democrat, who maybe 10, 15 years ago wouldn't have said the same thing, right? And, whatever expands our tent and brings in more of the independent centrist, voters that are out there, I'm good with that, right? And then that's how you win places like Texas and other states that we have a harder time winning, right? I mean, I don't think going super left wins in places, right? I mean, sure, Mamdani in New York, yeah, New York is a liberal bastion, right? It's New York, right? Of course. But no one's going to convince me that you could run Mamdani in Texas and win, right? Like, I don't see that.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because stepping away from all of this, it's the money, right? When Beto was in the race, it forced Republicans to spend a lot of money on Ted Cruz. It also ended up, causing Democrats to waste a lot of money on Beto. It goes both ways. I guess they sort of cancel themselves out when you think about it. But do you think Talerico is going to force Republicans to spend real money to defend Texas this cycle, regardless of who the candidate is?
I mean, well, first of all, I mean, Republicans are already spending money, right? Because I mean, they were either spending money on Cornyn or Paxton or both, right? I mean, certainly some people were definitely spending money on Wesley too. But I think, look, I think normally my answer to this question would be, if I didn't think we had any shot in any chance and there wasn't a chance of a perfect storm, my answer would be stop worrying about Texas, don't pay attention to it. And, we've got 36 governors races that are coming up. If you're worried about the Senate, you should look at North Carolina and Maine, Alaska, Ohio. We got to protect Georgia. We got to protect seats that have, open primaries right now for New Hampshire and Michigan, things like that. Right. I think that still remains true, right? Like, I mean, I will say I advised plenty of donors who did, some of which donated to James and are supporting James, but there are plenty of them who I think also are very hesitant to jump into a Texas Senate race, right? Like they would rather probably put money into these 36 governors races or North Carolina with Roy Cooper or, whoever shakes out in Maine, Alaska, things like that. And, look, I think what Republicans have done a masterful job of, and you have to give them credit, right? They've done a masterful job of getting Democrats to spend money in states and races that we don't have a chance of winning, right? The Beto example was a great example where we dumped God knows how much money into that race.
Over 100 million,
spent,
yeah.
Right. And like the logic always becomes, if we didn't spend all that money there, could we have spent it somewhere else and actually have won in those places, right? Now, look, 26 is a weird version of that, right? Because, we have to win the House. And there's a ton of districts that we could win, obviously, with all the gerrymandering fight that's happened, right? We really need to take the House, and it's our best chance to really put a check on the Trump administration by winning that House, right? I think the governor's races are just as important, given that, I mean, we have seen that governors have been the ones that have been standing up to this administration since day one, whether it's filing lawsuits or, frankly, like doing stuff they need to do in their own states, dealing with the ICE insurgency and all this other stuff that's happening. I mean, those races are critical and super, super important for us. And, I think to certain donors, they're saying, well, I could put money into X governor's race and that's protecting an entire state versus putting it into a Senate race that we might or may not win. Right. And I think that's the question mark. I think if we can get us into a position where, again, this perfect storm does happen, where maybe it is Paxton and it's Paxton versus Talerico, and Republicans come out of that runoff super bloodied, a lot of bad blood. James can kind of be this middle of the road, you don't like either of them, or maybe you don't like them enough that you want to show up for them, and we get all of our folks out. I think then, yeah, like I said, in that situation, that could be money well spent. But again, that's requiring a lot of things to go right. Versus, North Carolina. If you dump a ton of money into Roy Cooper's race, I think we have a really good chance at North Carolina, right? No one's going to tell me that we don't have a better chance in North Carolina and Maine than we do in Texas, right? We just do, right? But it's about priorities. It's about making sure that we have the right money put all over to win everywhere. I mean, look, I'd love for the Democrats' idea of that 50-state strategy to be a thing and be real and successful. But, we also have to be smart and practical about how we use our resources and where we use our resources. And, I don't think we were smart and wise in how we've spent it in Texas in the past. I don't think that by putting it into certain races in the country that we've been previously, that we've done a good job spending money. I think it's about, can we do that correctly this time and potentially win?
Yeah. I am wondering, though, the Trump factor of it all. Once he puts his finger on the scale, whether it's for Paxton or Cornyn, is that going to make it much more difficult for Talerico? Or can we assume that Talerico has taken back Trump's gains in parts of Texas with Hispanics and that it really won't have that same impact it's had in prior elections?
I think if you asked a lot of folks on the other side of the aisle, they thought for sure it was a done deal. He was going to endorse Paxton. It was going to be a thing. And then, I mean, yeah, it was really, really close. But Cornyn, by all accounts, whether it was on the polling side or just turnout wise, Cornyn in the end, surprised people, right? He did better than people thought he was going to do. I mean, look, I quote that line about Trump always loving the winner's side of things, right? I mean, Trump loves a winner, right? I think the reason that Trump never endorsed anybody yet is because he doesn't want to back the person that doesn't win, right? Now, obviously, I think whoever he picks probably ends up winning the runoff, right? Whether that's Cornyn or Paxton, I think whoever he picks is going to win the runoff, right? Now, I think just because that happens, the smartest thing that Democrats can do is then not make this race all about Trump, right? I think where Jasmine, I think, may have, misstepped a little on that was making this race all about a reboot to Trump. And like, I think this has to be about Texas. It has to be about, does John Cornyn or Ken Paxton have the best interest of Texans at heart, right? Versus James Talarico, that I think makes a pretty good case that he cares about the people of Texas and that this isn't all about Trump, right? I mean, sure, it's going to make a difference on the Republican side, but to the independent and Democratic voters in that state, I mean, I think it's about, gas prices are going to be what they are, price at the grocery store is going to be what it is. Healthcare is going to be what it is, right? I think, the right person messaging that they can be the one to actually help serve the people of Texas that way versus the, I'm going to bow down to Trump. That's not the right message on the Republican side. I think you're going to see that the second after Trump throws his support behind one person, they'll use that to, obviously get a bunch of money that gets thrown into that one person. They'll use it to help with certain turnout come election time. But really, I think they're going to then pivot to just starting to attack Democrats and attacking James. It's not going to be about, vote for me because I'm the biggest MAGA loyalist. That's just to win the runoff, right? That's not going to be how it is for the general, right? Just for the runoff, they have to prove who's the one that's the anointed one, as they'd say, by Trump.
But it doesn't really matter. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the Kamala Harris endorsement didn't work in the beginning. It didn't work for Jasmine. And do you think that if Talerico goes even further and he sort of rejects the establishment of the party, he hasn't done that yet, but to go after Biden, to go after Kamala Harris, which do you think that will help him in the general election?
I don't think he needs to. I think, like I said, I think the more he talks about Texas and Texas values and talks about what's going to help the people of Texas, the better chance he has, right? Like I said, I view Kamala Harris as completely irrelevant to this race. I think, there's no point in talking about Biden or the other stuff. Like in the end, as much as Trump wants to blame Biden for every single thing that goes wrong or is going wrong with his administration, I mean, a lot of these things are his own doing, right? Like Joe Biden didn't decide to bomb Iran and then now seeing what gas prices are, right? Like Joe Biden didn't decide to, send ICE to all of these cities and, cause a lot of backlash, right? Like Joe Biden, isn't mentioned, what is it, 36,000 whatever times in the Epstein files, right? Like these are all things that have nothing to do with Joe Biden and frankly nothing to do with Kamala Harris either. That like this idea that that for some reason that a Democrat should be responding to it the same way that Trump does. I think it doesn't make any sense. I think Talerico should be talking about the issues that matter to Texas, whether that's, affordability being the issue, healthcare being the issue, generally just, economic things. I mean, what was it? The Carville lines, the economy stupid, right? Like, just like, I would rather
affordability, the thing that Trump that calls a hoax and can't talk about.
He can keep calling it a hoax all he wants, but it's what he ran on to win in 24. And he hasn't done a damn thing about it since. Right. So, I mean, look, in the end, I want, whether it's James or frankly, any candidate around the country to be talking about the issues that matter to people, because I think that's how we're going to win.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question from T Hamilton 007. Thanks for tuning in. Does Alex think Democrats can win the House and Senate in midterms? Thank you both.
House, I think absolutely. I think we've got a great chance at the House. And I want to again give another shout out to the governor's side of things too. And like I know that gets lost in the shuffle sometimes between the House and the Senate, but I think we got a great chance at winning a lot of these governor's races. House, I think we have a great chance. On the Senate side, look, I think North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, I think Ohio is kind of on the bubble, right? I think those are races that we have a really, really good chance in, right? You want to then throw Texas in the mix, like I said, perfect storm. Let's see what happens. But North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, Ohio, I mean, those are places where I think we have a really, really good chance if we play our cards right. We've got obviously a stellar candidate in North Carolina with Roy Cooper. Maine, I think, depending on how that primary shakes out, either one will emerge as a great candidate for us to hopefully win in that state. And, I think Alaska, certainly I think we've got a chance there. Ohio, look, Sherrod Brown running again, it means that that's a real thing. I wish more people would have paid attention to Ohio over the last few years. I mean, certainly, look, I would have loved for a guy like Tim Ryan to have run for governor there and have been on the ticket for that at the same time. But certainly, I really think, that's a state that if we're talking about where affordability matters and we're talking about where some of the impacts of some of the things that Trump has done and Republicans have done over the last few years, Ohio definitely feels it. I think a guy like Sherrod Brown definitely understands that, and I think, that's something we should look at. But then again, like I said, we got to hold on to Georgia, right? We have to hold on to the Michigan seat. So whoever shakes out of that primary too, right? And, places like New Hampshire. So, I would say, the range for us on the Senate side is anywhere between 49 seats and 51 seats, right?
Wow.
I think 49 is the low end, and I think 51 is the high end. I don't think we're going above that.
Okay, here's a question from Jesus Costa. Will the Republicans be able to come together after a bruising primary?
Great question. I assume this is speaking just to Texas, right? I mean, look, I think what's the old adage that Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line, right? I think that has been a consistent thing that has happened. Certainly, I think the MAGA stuff has definitely thrown a little bit of a wrench in that normally. But, it's hard for me to imagine that regardless of who wins in Texas, that the Texas Republicans don't, come together and say, okay, great, time to go beat the Democrat, right? I think it also depends on who is at the top of the ticket, right? And, who Trump picks, right? I mean, if Trump goes with Cornyn, well, Cornyn's been there forever, right? And he is the tried and true person there. I think a lot of people who would have been Paxton supporters, I think they will go with Cornyn because of that. I think it's the other way around, though, of like, do Cornyn supporters necessarily go with Paxton, right? I mean, I think obviously, they're much more traditional Republican, right? They are the right. They are the establishment Republican, right? Do they go with it? I mean, that, to be clear, that same establishment type of Republican wanted Ken Paxton gone only a year or two ago, right? So, I mean, this idea that like they're going to get behind him, maybe. I mean, I think most of them are going to get in line behind the Republican because that's what Republicans do. But I'd love to pick away at some of them to not necessarily come out and vote for James, as great as that would be. Don't get me wrong. Like if they want to hold their nose and say, I don't agree with him all the time, but I can agree with him 70% of the time, and that's better than Paxton, I'll take it. But I'd also happily take that they just stay home and don't vote. Right. Like, I mean,
choose the couch, kids.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, I don't have a problem if a bunch of them want to stay home because they're mad that their Republican candidate didn't win. That's fine by me. Whatever helps us win.
Yeah, I mean, 2 sets of voters already rejected Cornyn in the first round of voting, and is that really survivable?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, and it's a good way to think about it, right? That like, however many votes Paxton got, however many votes Wesley got, right? Those were people saying, I would rather have one of these people over John Cornyn, right? Now, you can argue that just because of that doesn't mean that everybody who voted for Wesley wants to then have Paxton, right? I mean,
that's true.
A lot of them may have just said, I don't want John Cornyn, but I definitely don't want Ken Paxton, right? Like, I think there's plenty of people on that side that probably think that. And it's a question of, okay, do those folks go one way or the other? I mean, I can see a bunch of those voters going to Cornyn. That wouldn't shock me, right? Because in the end, they may not love Cornyn, but if they hate Paxton, they're like, well, that's a bridge too far for me. But like I said, if they want to stay home, I'm also fine with that.
If you had to put money on the runoff today, who wins?
Whoever Trump endorses. But I mean, like I said, I think Trump wants a winner, right? I think it would be hard for me to imagine after Cornyn outperforming that he doesn't now have a window to get Trump's endorsement and win. But I also like, it's such a wild card because I think it's all about who whispers and says the right thing at the right time, right? I mean, the thing that obviously Ken Paxton has been running on has been that like, I'm the true MAGA loyalist. I'm the true MAGA, whatever, right? And I mean, how much of this is a loyalty thing versus a winning thing, right? And by the way, yeah, Cornyn and them may have, bashed heads on a couple of things here and there, but overwhelmingly Cornyn's voted with Trump's stuff over almost every time, right? So like, I mean, you can't really say that Cornyn hasn't been a Trump and MAGA loyalist either, right? By that regard. So like, I don't know. I think it's hard for me to imagine that he doesn't want to pick the winner in this race because he hates losing, as we well know. So I don't know. I mean, like, I think if I'm the Democrats looking at this, I don't want it to be Cornyn. I want it to be Paxton. Right. And I think if me as a Democrat is saying that, I think the smart people are saying, well, then maybe he should be
just like they were hoping it would be Jasmine.
Right.
They were hoping Jasmine. But here's the thing. I find it because I know the swamp very well. Jeff Rowe is an enemy of Chris LaCivita. Chris LaCivita was Trump's former co-campaign manager, who's working with John Cornyn. You would think because of his relationship with Trump, he would have been able to get Trump to give an endorsement to Cornyn. And Trump supposedly does not like Jeff Rowe because of whatever LaCivita has whispered in his ear about Jeff Rowe. And Jeff Rowe is working on Paxton's campaign. But clearly Trump doesn't really care about these political consultants. He's just like, I don't want to lose. He would give
and politics is a what have you done for me lately business, right?
Yeah. What was that?
I mean, I think it's a what have you done for me lately business. It's a lot of these, like, we've talked about this. There's plenty of former Trump ex person, you to fill in the blank, right? I mean, do we think that Donald Trump is calling up former whoever and saying, hey, what do you think about this? No, of course not.
He does actually. He's a little weird like that. He
does have reporters for sure. I don't know about if every single former Trump ever person who's in the weeds on campaign.
Well, it just tells you the relationship. It shows you how close they actually are to Trump. And in Washington, everyone is selling access. That is what their business is. There's one last question we are going to take from you awesome audience participants. What did the Democratic turnout in Texas tell us about the midterms? What do you think, Alex?
It's a good question. Look, I think there is definitely Democratic enthusiasm for sure. I mean, I make it my business to go to as many states in a year as humanly possible, to not just be the whole inside the beltway, only hear about what happens here. And, I mean, this is anecdotal for sure, but whether it's Uber driver or hotel worker or, bartender, waitress, waiter, whatever, I mean, I talk to all of them and always say like, oh, like, who are you voting for? Who'd you vote for the last election? Like, what do you think about what's going on? What issues do you care about? And, you're definitely starting to see a little bit of a shift. I think, over the last year, certainly when Trump first took over in January, I think Democrats were in the absolute toilet. Like there was nowhere lower where we could have gone for how people thought about Democrats at that point. And I think, we definitely stumbled over the last year as a party. And, I think stuff with somehow how we handled the shutdown or just, up against Trump, this idea of, people didn't like what Democrats stood for. They didn't like how we fought or didn't fight. Right. I think that over the last certainly 4 or 5 months, that's definitely changed. Right. I think people are starting to see Democrats actually standing up for things, starting to really fight, starting to really say, this is not what you were promised and they lied to you. And this is just a giant grift on the Republican side. And I think Democrats are starting to finally get that if we talk about the issues that matter, if we focus on those issues that matter, if we put up candidates that are authentic and, actually represent these folks, and if we don't take the bait, frankly, and run down every single rabbit hole that they throw at us, that chances are that Trump and the Republicans are going to do enough to kind of bury themselves and say enough stupid things or do enough stupid things that people are going to go, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. Or like, that's definitely not what I want. And like, at least the other side is talking about things that I care about. Right. I think, one of the things that we've talked about with folks previously and a lot of my donors have cared about, I mean, there's been a ton of special elections since Trump took over and Democrats are winning there all the time. Right. It's all around the country. We've been winning those special elections. Right. Now, look, you can argue that we're a lot better as a party when, the eye of Sauron focuses on one specific thing. And sure, that's a really good criticism. But I think that we're winning in places in these special elections that we don't necessarily normally win in. And that's a direct reflection on Trump and the Republicans and how they're quote unquote governing or not governing. Right. So, I think Texas and the special elections and other places around the country are just representation that I think people are pissed. I think, I've got one donor that always says that people are broke, scared, and pissed. Right. And I think that's a That's a really good thing to understand what the average person in America thinks and feels right now. And I think Democrats are showing that they're the only party that's really focusing on ways to help people versus, either trying to get rich off the American people or off some giant grift, or, not releasing things like the Epstein files or dropping a bunch of bombs and starting another war in the Middle East.
I think as a national party, they've had a hard time actually coming up with any great ideas except anti-Trump resistance. But I do think you're right, within the states and within these candidates are the ones who are speaking to the people on the ground. At a national level, I haven't seen anything too inspiring or too great coming out of Congress.
No, I mean, there's that line consistently that about Democrats that I use all the time, is that we're really great at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, right? So like, just to be clear, this isn't over, right? Like, just because we had a good showing and we got the right candidate in Texas doesn't mean that we necessarily win Texas, right? It also doesn't necessarily mean that we win the midterms. Like, we have a lot of work to do, right? We have a lot of money that needs to be raised. We have a lot of messaging that needs to be done. We have to keep fighting on the ground in these states and doing what matters. But, like I said, as long as we keep putting up the right candidates, talking about the right issues, and as long as Trump and the Republicans on that side keep doing what they're doing, I think we have a really good chance, right? And, look, I don't want us to then get into that mindset of, okay, now we should just pat ourselves on the back and we all, get to say mission accomplished, we're all good and done here. Like, no, because then we got 28 and then we have to focus on 30 and 32, right? Like, we need to be the party that doesn't just always live in win now mode, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm obviously a big sports fan, and I always, I happen to root for certain teams that are always in win now mode, right? And that's great for sports, but it's not great for politics, right? I mean, if we're always in win now mode versus like, how do we build for long-term success? That's how you get to where the Republicans were, right? Like, Trump becoming president in 2016 was after decades of long-term planning, right? The idea of Project 2020. Oh yeah, not necessarily Trump, but Republicans itself. Think about it.
The Tea Party. I think it was.
I mean,
I actually think that was born out of chaos. I don't think that was born out of strategy.
No. I think Trump was a vessel for what showed up in 2016. Did they think in 2016 it was going to be Trump? No, they were like, it's going to be Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz. It's going to be one of these guys are going to be the guy, right? Like, they didn't think it was going to be Trump. He became a vessel that inherited decades worth of serious infrastructure and long-term planning that the Republicans did, right? We haven't had a version of that. I mean, listen, Project 2025 is a great example. That's not something that just came out of thin air. That's something that's been worked on for a long time, right? That's long-term planning. Democrats, like, we need to be in that mindset and that mentality. I want us to win the midterms, absolutely, but then we got to figure out how do we win the next one, and plan that out.
You're actually exhausting me right now. Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. I can tell from everyone who's commenting, they are really enjoying it. And I thank you all for joining. And the way to support this show is to hit the subscribe button, follow the red letter, follow me on the TaraPalmieri.com, become a paid subscriber. You can get my exclusive reporting straight to your inbox, support independent journalism. And that is how you can never miss out on all of my great work and my great guests like Alex, who always keep it real with me. And that is a great thing. The conversation that we are having right now, the same conversation that we would be having over the phone. And I only choose guests that I know are going to keep it real. We don't need spin. So
that's right.
Thanks to all of you. And we'll do this again soon. Bye.
Looking forward to it.